Howdy, everyone. College Humanities 4. How we all doing tonight? It is cold out there, but it's going to warm up a little tomorrow. Um, I think when the clouds clear tomorrow, that we're going to see snow all around us, which would be nice. We need it. Hopefully, you guys are working hard on your papers. Did you see my lecture on San Pecapa? Uh, please do, because you could use some of it in your papers on themes and why the movie's important, not just to film historians, but to all of cinema history. But we're moving on to the 80s now, and it's a strange decade in Hollywood. If you remember seeing this Easy Rider Raging Bulls documentary, remember how it ended? We had films like Star Wars dominating the box office. So we changed from auteur films to essentially big budgeted B films that the studios know how to do, and so they start cranking that stuff out, and they went into the whole decade, and they still are to this day. Um, it started the endless sequels. In the old days, once in a while there would be a sequel. It's very rare. Now, if a movie, they started making movies so they could have sequels, and that means, I hate to say it, folks, it's not honest filmmaking because they're going to make it that the heroes survive, and where in the old days the heroes didn't survive. Whatever movie you're watching, that was it. That was the end of the movie. You're not going to see them again. You don't know what they're going to do in their real life. I mean, their life after the movie, or if they're going to die, or maybe they die in the movie. That's it. They're dead. They can't come back. But that's not how they started designing films. When they saw how much money they could make in these sequels, like Star Wars, and how we're still doing Star Wars here almost 40 years later, endless, and then we got prequels and sequels and they have network series, and they focus on one character. It's endless, and they started doing that during this time in the 80s, like with Superman, the first Superman with Christopher Reeves. It was successful, so they make another one and another one. Then he has that tragic accident. You know about that, right? The actor Christopher Reeves had a horse accident, broke his neck, was paralyzed from the neck down, and had to breathe through a respirator, um, and died tragically a few years later because of that injury. Um, he was Superman, but I guess, oh, it was an actor playing Superman. That's the problem. They aren't superhero folks. The Black Panther is an actor. X-Men, Wolverine is an actor. He comes from Australia, and he's not that tough. It's all Hollywood bravado. John Wick isn't that tough. It's Keanu Reeves, folks. That's who John Wick is. Don't want to bust the bubble, but we've got to the point in our filmmaking where people actually are believing these characters possibly exist. I mean, go to Comic Con. That's a good one. People dress up as their heroes, from Star Trek to Star Wars to John, whoever, whatever comic book heroes out there, and they start believing that they're real. It's real, and that's where it gets into trouble. Um, these films are fantasy, entertaining. Yes, I admit, um, but shouldn't be taken too serious as the holy truth. That is for sure. But sequels in the 1980s, they kind of ran out of ideas in Hollywood. They never have great ideas. That's what filmmakers bring into Hollywood is the ideas. And then they enact on them. And if they make money, they take the credit for it. Rocky 1, Rocky 2, Rocky 3, Rambo 1, Rambo 2, Rambo 3, and they'll run with it and they'll make millions off of it. And it gets very cynical how much money they can make off these things. And so they design the next one to make more money than the previous one, even though it's essentially the sequels. Sometimes it's the same film. I mean, if you look at some of these sequels, they're almost the same film, the same story over, just changed a little bit. So then they run out of ideas and they just start doing prequels. Jaws 1, 2, 3. Then we do the prequels before. Same with Star Wars. Now Obi-Wan Kenobi's a teenager running around. So they got to keep the franchise going somehow. And there is a cynicism in that kind of filmmaking. It's a collective filmmaking. If you look at credits on movies today or starting in the 80s, it's endless credits. You'll see six writers, because what they do now is they'll have one writer who specializes in action. So he or she will write the action sequences. Then they get someone to write the female dialogue, someone who's good at that. And then they get someone who only writes the bad guys dialogue because they're good at that. And someone writes the good guys dialogue. And what happens with your movie? It gets so watered down. It's hard to see what the theme is. It's hard to see what they're actually trying to get at. There's not a It's not cohesive. It's it's still very entertaining because they jazz it up with music and sound effects to make you forget that the story is lacking and there's holes in the script that don't make any sense. Where there's one writer who slaves over a script for 2 or 3 years, you won't see that sort of thing. So look at those films I ask you to watch, like you did your paper on Five Easy Pieces, The Wild Bunch. One, two writers at the most, a singular vision, and it stays true to the vision for the 2 hours length of the movie. But all this current filmmaking that is going on in Hollywood, I'm talking about Hollywood now, not foreign countries. I'm going to get do a whole thing on foreign films soon. Um, how the global village has really developed into the savior to me of cinema, because they're doing real honest cinema, what they call art house cinema. I'd rather see a piece of art than a piece of crap in a mall theater. They put that art house uh, title on there to kind of turn off the average viewer who go, "Oh, that's for snobs." No, it's just for thinking, concerning people who maybe read a book in their life and who maybe have higher ideals than a superhero who could punch somebody through a wall. So the films of the 80s were troublesome, especially we came out of that great decade of the 70s with all 100 of our greatest films we've ever done. Scholars call it the last golden age of movies. I agree with that. Now, I'm a different generation. You don't have to agree with it, but once you study cinema and you get outside of your own generation and you can see the past, you'll see what I'm talking about. That's just like reading literature. You have to read the 19th century literature to understand the 20th century literature. You just can't live on Stephen King. Not to take anything away from him. He's a popular writer, but he's standing on the shoulders of a lot of writers that came before him. Same thing with these filmmakers. Um, they're standing on the shoulders of the old silent films. There'd be no Star Wars unless there was Metropolis. There'd be no Friday the 13th unless there's Nosferatu. It all goes back to original storytelling with a camera. It's just the cameras have gotten more sophisticated now. Cameras could do anything. You could send them into outer space and film shooting down if you want, because it's all computerized. It's not real. So anyway, but in the 80s, this is when it was all starting to co uh, become what it is today. Okay, uh, they're like some of the most popular films of the '80s. You probably love them. That's fine. Um, would be hang on a sec. Would be Top Gun with Tom Cruise. Highly entertaining, macho, pro military, pro war movie. They just did the sequel, and it made a huge bundle of money. Tom Cruise is 60, and he's still running around like he's 14 years old. Action all the way. He's going to get the girl. He's going to win the win because he's a winning personality, and his money's make a boatload of money, and that's where the truth is now. So there were some films like Top Gun were huge, Superman huge. And what they're doing now um, in with the sequels. Another popular film of that day that made a lot of money was called Goonies. It's a Steve Spielberg type of film made with his people. It's his story. It's very typical to Steve Spielberg, which means it's very sentimental. About this one's about kids chasing a treasure map, and it's exciting. They're almost like serials that they made in the 30s. That's where he based a lot of his filmmaking ideas on. Indiana Jones is based on 40s serials that they used to have in movie theaters, which was a regular thing. There'd be a 10-minute episode of a serial. It could be Commander Cody. It could be there were so many of them that were popular. There were short movies that they played before the main film, and there'd be a next one next month, and so you couldn't wait to see the next episode. And Indiana Jones was definitely based on those serials, and so many of his films are like that, which is exciting, but it is limiting on how deep it could go. The story. Keep it lightweight, keep it entertaining, keep it humorous. Yes, have some violence, but make it pretty innocuous and not have uh, uh, any devastating uh, elements to the story. Um, but in Goonies, he didn't direct it, but all his people, Amblin Productions, it's a Steven Spielberg, his handprint, fingerprints are all over it. Um, I'm getting a message from someone. I have no idea, so I'm going to turn my phone off. What am I saying? Goonies, yeah. That's what stars children actors who they're all in their 50s now because that movie came out, I think, in, I want to say 85, 84. Uh, filmed up here in Astoria, Oregon. You guys know Astoria? I love Astoria. Uh, all filmed up there locally. Once again, made a lot of money. And that was kind of the the tenor of the day. Where were the art films? Where were the auteur filmmakers? Well, they're still out there. They're struggling to get their films made. Sam Peckinpah couldn't get a film made. His last one or two films, Convoy, is a horrible film. Executive action, not much better. He couldn't even get hired. He drifted into drug addiction, alcoholism. He was unreliable. And he spent his last 4 or 5 years trying to get a job, trying to sell a script, and he couldn't do it. Died of a heart attack at 58 years old. Lived in Montana, by the way, for 5 years in a hotel, the Murray Hotel. Yes, folks, I've been there. Livingston, Montana. A sad ending to a troubled. I hate to use the word genius, but with two or three of his movies, it definitely applies. This was well not Peckinpah's era. He'd outlived his era. Hal Ashby, who directed some great movies in the 70s, from Harold and Maude to Shampoo to this Bound for Glory, the 80s was not his era either. And he was in the movie that you watched, the documentary. He died of cancer in the 80s, but his dad was he was at loose ends, but he had a great day. For 10 years. He did wonderful work, starting with The Landlord. Anyway, so a lot of filmmakers did not make the transition to the 80s that were in this, and they didn't make it because of drug addiction or they messed up. Their style of filmmaking was just not selling at the box office. Even Martin Scorsese struggled through that decade. He made a couple great films, possibly one of his greatest films, Goodfellas, at the very end of the decade. And he's still making films, but he struggled during the 80s because they weren't buying his vision, the singular vision. They're only buying the collective vision and the idea that you work with all these other writers and producers and directors, and you don't know who's at the helm anymore. And this is also the era when actors started becoming more powerful than the directors. It had always been considered a director's medium, filmmaking. They're the ones that point the camera. They're the ones that stage the scenes. They're the ones who usually write the scripts, hire the people, eh, the actors too. But actors became very, very popular during this era, so much so that it wasn't the director that was popular, it was the actor. A good example would be Tom Cruise, Sylvester Stallone. Uh, all of a sudden, it wasn't, we didn't care who directed it. As long as it starred Sylvester Stallone, we'd go see it. Same thing with Tom Cruise. So it became an actor's medium, still is, folks, to a large extent. Um, just look at the top actors that are still making these movies right now, that's popular right now, whatever they are. They have a lot of power. They have the power of picking the directors, power of picking their co-stars, power of rewrite scripts. And it really started here in the 80s with people like Mel Gibson, with his series of films, the Mad Max, and he did the buddy films, Lethal Weapon, one, two, three, whatever. And they became the selling point, not the director or the writers. Nobody paid attention to that anymore. It was the actor. And there's very few women in this, folks, because women don't make as much money at the box office because they're doing women films. That always is different than a male action film. The audience became a different audience. It became 18 to 24-year-old men, males. And they wanted to see action, they wanted to see violence, and they wanted the women to shut up and just look pretty. And they want to follow a star, a male star, Stallone, Mel Gibson, the rest of them, Tom Cruise. And those actors were in the sweet spot of having all the power. And they held on to power for years. Tom Cruise still holds on to it. Mel Gibson lost his because he's a racist a hole. Um, but he's still out there, still be able to make a living. Um, so that was happening in the 80s. So the 80s was this time of big shift in Hollywood. And we're not talking about the foreign market yet. I'll talk about that next week. Um, things are starting to hop there, especially in Asia. John Woo films from China, Ang Lee films from Taiwan were starting to percolate and become popular at the box office. That's what box office talks loudest in Hollywood. But there was a couple of filmmakers I want to point out before I shut up that held their head up pretty high during the 80s. One would be John Sayles, who made his living off writing screenplays for Hollywood, kind of budgeted screenplays like Piranha, which actually is a pretty good movie. And he could make a living off doing that. And then he would get enough money to direct his own film. Return of the Secaucus Seven was one that put him on the map, made for 50, $60,000 with friends of his. And it predated The Big Chill barely, about college people who got together after the 10 years of graduating and where their lives go wrong or right, which was a popular theme for that time because the filmmakers were that age. And everybody was in a retrospective mood of 10 years after you get out of school. Now what? Where are you? Are you where you need to be? And so he went on to make some hard looking films. Mount One is probably his best. And they always sometimes had a political agenda. And in the meantime, he was kept selling scripts to make money so he could make his films. And he would sell them to the art houses, and they'd play at college campuses and play in Europe markets. Another filmmaker of the time, David Lynch, maybe you've heard of him. He's probably, I don't know, I'm saying he's probably the most popular out of this bunch I'm talking about. Um, but he didn't. He started off making a film called Eraserhead. It's on YouTube for free. Uh, if I remember right, I'll put some YouTube previews up for this stuff so you see what I'm talking about. Eraserhead is definitely an art film. It was his film school film that he made to graduate film school, and it's a bizarre, surreal story of the highest order. You'll never see anything more bizarre. But he caught the eye of the producers of this next movie, which was Mel Gibson. Hmm, oh, it's horrible. I can't think of his last name. I'll come up with it. He was producing a movie called The Elephant Man, and he had made a name off of comedies like Blazing Saddles and so many others. And he was a comedian, still alive in his 90s. Why can't I think of his last name? Mel Brooks. Anyway, Mel Brooks. He liked what he saw in Eraserhead, thought he'd be a good director for this movie called The Elephant Man, which was a Hollywood production made off a famous play, adapted from a famous play with the actor John Hurt rather. Um, and in black, he shot it black and white, just like Eraserhead. Then he went on to make a film adaptation of Dune, the sci-fi epic novel, and it was a bust. He was the wrong director for that. It was too quirky and surreal and did not capture the novel. And after that, he had to go back to out of Hollywood to get money to make his films like Blue Velvet, which is perhaps his masterpiece. Uh, and then he created hmm, he created the TV series that it was a revolutionary, but he didn't do it until the 90s, and it's still popular. And I'm drawing a blank on that too. This is horrible. I should write. You think I'd write this stuff down, but I usually know this stuff, so I don't have to. But I'm going to look at Twin Peaks, of course. Twin Peaks. He created that, wrote it, and directed a lot of that. Became a huge cult favorite, and then he did Lost Highway and Inland Empire, his most recent film, which is not everybody's cup of tea, folks. David Lynch. He got to have a pretty good career, and that's what he's known for. These art films, always with kind of grotesque characters. Just watch Blue Velvet, Dennis Hopper. You know what I'm talking about. Another filmmaker at the time that started off with a great little film called Stranger in Paradise. Jim Jarmusch, who's exactly my age, folks, and he's kind of a hero of mine because his films are they're esoteric, but they're really cool. They are, and started with Stranger in Paradise. He's comes from the New York City um, punk rock, new wave era of New York filmmakers and musicians. And after he did Stranger in Paradise, he did Mystery Train and Down by Law, one of my favorite all-time films, um, in black and white, by the way. Um, he did a film with Johnny Depp called Dead Man, which is a surreal western in black and white, by the way. Uh, and he did a great vampire movie recently called The Only Lovers Left Alive. Really a good vampire movie. Uh, so he has his taste in things is usually very cool and groovy and very hip. And so he has that following. He gets most of his financing overseas because his movies don't make any money here. Some do, but most of them don't. But he's had a very successful art film career, which is really hard to pull off in the United States of America. Um, then there's the last one I'm going to talk about is Spike Lee, one of the few African American art directors out there. Started off, in film school, making films there. He teaches there now. He actually gives back and teaches classes at NYU. Uh, and his films, maybe you've seen them. Uh, She's Got to Have It was his first movie, filmed in black and white, by the way. I keep saying that because a lot of times it is budgetary, but it's also times it's aesthetic. Black and white is a beautiful aesthetic, and you have to appreciate it for its own self, not for a budgetary reasons. And then he did Do the Right Thing, which really put him on the map. And he's done some great films and not so great films. Son of Sam, I think, is one of his best. And he mostly is known for doing, he does Nike commercials. He acts in all his movie. Maybe you know who I'm talking about, Spike Lee. Um, he's the one that goes up against Tarantino. And I agree with Spike Lee on this because Tarantino overuses the N word. And, but Tarantino really is a poser. He thinks he's understands black culture because he understood black exploitation films for some reason. So if you watch any of his movies, Jackie Brown, any of them, they're dropping the black characters, not the white characters, are dropping the N word a ton. And Spike Lee goes, foul play. Anyway, so those are the filmmakers that have stayed the course. They're still making films. I haven't seen a film from John Sayles in a while, but all these filmmakers are still out there. David Lynch doesn't want to make anymore. He said, it's going to take quite a bit for him to come out. He's a painter and uh, he's getting up there in age, his early 70s. And it takes a lot of energy to make a film, folks. Physical energy, not just mental energy. Anyway, on that count, that's the 80s. Next time I talk to you, we'll be talking about more of the 80s with foreign markets opening up. And then we'll get into the 90s. Uh, Take our Thanksgiving break, and after that, it's downhill from here. We'll probably do one more essay after this one, The Wild Bunch. I don't know what it's going to be yet. Maybe it's going to be one of these art films. It probably will be. And then you're going to do a research paper. I'm going to give you the topics. You'll have 2 weeks to write it. It'll be your last paper you hand in on topic I choose. I'll probably give you 5 choices of topics to choose from. It'll probably be a genre. And you write a research paper, not an essay. We'll talk about this later. You'll have to do research and have a works cited page, the whole bit, and then keep up on your journals because you're going to probably need the 10 points. Now keep up in your discussions, and I'll see you the next time down the road. The story film continues.